He is the editor and contributing author to the book Jasenovac and the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, Analysis and Survivor Testimonies, published in 2006, and as co-editor brought out a new edition after 50 years of the book The Crimes Against the Fascist Occupants and Their Collaborators Against Jews in Yugoslavia in 2005. In 1999, he conducted videotaped interviews of refugees from Kosovo and later testified as a witness at the International Criminal Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia at The Hague. Professor Lituchy is currently editing a book on the late UN Secretary General Kurt Wadenham. He is the founder and executive director of the Jasenovac Research Institute and editor of its publication, and also vice president of the Holocaust Memorial Park in Brooklyn, New York. He has written and lectured on Balkan history and has been a guest lecturer at universities, museums, and Holocaust institutions in the US and Canada, including recently at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City. I welcome Professor Lituchy.
Thank you, Professor Petrovich. I want to thank Professor Petrovich, Professor Neil Kaplan. I hope we'll see Professor Kaplan today. And also, of course, I want to thank the Kleinman Family Foundation for having me here for the 16th annual symposium on the Holocaust and on genocide here at Vanier College. So I also want to thank Vanier College. All of you are probably aware of the fact that yesterday marked the day that is called Yom HaShoah, the Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust. That's known around the world. And but today, actually, today, April 22nd, is also a very important day, because on this day, 64 years ago, the last 2,000 or so inmates at the concentration camp known as Jasenovac in wartime Croatia, which later became part of Yugoslavia, organized their uprising and breakout out of the camp. It's one of the most extraordinary and heroic stories of the Holocaust and also of the 20th century. On the morning of April 22nd, and that's exactly 64 years ago today, on the morning of the 22nd, the remaining 2,000 or so inmates planned all night what they were going to do to break out. The previous day, on April 21st, now these were the male inmates. The previous day, on April 21st, the women inmates, the last remaining 700 women inmates, had been marched to their deaths. They were all summarily executed. On that day, April 21st, and this was, of course, fresh in the memories of the male inmates, on April 21st, the male inmates, the male prisoners and the women prisoners were marched to separate places inside the camp. The women, and at one point, the two lines of the women and the men actually converged. And of course, they were being watched by the fascist guards carrying submachine guns. And as they passed, or as they approached each other, they just in total disregard for the fascist guards, they began to break out in song as they approached each other. The women coming in one direction, the men coming in another direction, and approaching each other. And they began to sing these songs of liberation, these fight songs of the underground partisan resistance, the underground resistance movement. And, of course, the guards told them to shut up, but they continued to do it. And then as they met it's an extraordinary moment. As the two lines meet on April 21st, they just stopped. And they just stopped and they sort of stood in front of each other and looked at each other. They couldn't touch each other, they couldn't do anything because the guards were there and they were already beating them. But they just refused to march any further and they stopped for a moment. And then the guards took control of the situation and moved them forward. And the women continued to sing the songs of the partisan movement and the resistance songs. And then the women, about 700 of them, were executed. And so the males, I mean, it's a terribly tragic moment, but it was happening April 21st, that day, April 21st, 1945, because the fascists in World War II, led by Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler and his allies inside of Europe, which included the Croatian regime of Ante Pavelic, what was called the Ustaša movement, were about to lose the war in Europe. And so at this point, this concentration camp in Croatia was surrounded by partisan forces. The Soviet army was approaching from the east. Actually, they had already entered the country. And so the Croatian fascists running this camp decided that they would just liquidate the prisoners, kill all the prisoners. The inmates in the nighttime of April 21st, April 22nd stayed up all night to plan their breakout because they knew they had no choice. They would either have a breakout or else they would just simply be executed. But what they also recognized was that in attempting to do this breakout, they would probably also die as well. But it was better to fight and die than simply go to your death. Among the inmates, there were people of all 20 plus nationalities who lived in Yugoslavia at that time. But of course, there were only 3 nationalities that were particularly selected for extermination. And that, of course, the Jews, the Romas, or Romanis, or also known as the Gypsies, of which there were 200,000 before the war in Yugoslavia and only 100,000 after the war, because about 100,000 were slaughtered. And the Serbs, who not in the Croatian part of Yugoslavia were also targeted for mass extermination. The official policy was to kill a third, convert a third to Roman Catholicism, because the Croatian fascists were not just Nazis, but they were also religious fanatics as well. And convert a third to Roman Catholicism or deport a third. Well, the male inmates planning this represented all various groups from the nationalities of Yugoslavia. There were even Croatian, there was a large number of Croatian anti-fascists, it has to be recognized, who participated in and who were also punished. They weren't punished because they were Croatians. They weren't punished for their identity, for the fault of their birth, as Jews, Romas, and Serbs were. But they were punished for being anti-fascists, and so they too faced death. And they organized the breakout. One of the most interesting people among the prisoners that day who survived it, who later became a friend of mine, was at that time he was just about 21 years old, a young Jewish guy from Bosnia, who named Ados Shire, who was given the most extraordinary task. You're faced with your imminent death on this day. You know that you probably will not survive And believe me, of those 2,000, or actually, I'm sorry, at this point we're talking only about 1,200 inmates left on April 22nd because they had just killed about 700 plus women the day before. Of these 1,200 or so, only about 80 survived. I'll explain why that is so in a moment. They had no guns. They had no weapons. They actually had to throw their bodies. Some people would have to throw their bodies onto these fascists with machine guns and take the bullet, die probably, so that someone else, their comrade, could come and take that gun and then shoot the other fascists. But Ado Shire was given this extraordinary task of climbing a telephone pole inside the camp, right in front of all the machine gun installments, and cutting the telephone wires and telegraph cables so that there would be no call for reinforcements. This was a sure death mission. This was a mission where you were not supposed to survive. Extraordinarily, he managed to do his task, cut those wires, expecting to die. But somehow all the machine gun and rifle fire missed him. He was able to jump from the top of the telephone pole and run to freedom. Most of the 1,200 that day were not so lucky. As I said, only 80 of them survived. They rushed the machine gun encampments. They rushed guards. They had some sharp objects. They managed to kill and overcome some of the guards and take some of the machine guns. And they fought a valiant, though in some respects hopeless, battle against these armed fascists in Croatia, in the Jasenovac concentration camp. Most of the leaders of the uprising actually were killed. The actual formal leader was a Croatian communist named, I should say this because, we have to point out that there were perpetrators, but this is not about collective guilt. It's about specific groups in society who promote racial hatred and fascism. This Croatian communist was killed, but he was actually the main organizer of the outbreak. And so many of them were killed. Fortunately, in 1997, during the 1990s, in fact, I was able to meet those who survived from that time, quite a few of them, and we actually recorded their testimonies, which are of invaluable historical record for us to understand what actually happened, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. But why did they do this to a man and for those women who also were in other camps and faced similar situations? Because we have to talk about the women prisoners as well. There was always one answer, one obvious answer why they were willing to die on this day 64 years ago today, and that was so that the world would know what had happened to them and to their families and to their friends and to their communities, because not only were individual lives lost, not only were entire families wiped out, but entire communities were wiped out. Every trace of communities among Jews and Romas and Serbs were wiped out in Yugoslavia during World War II. And so that's also something that we have to emphasize. And this is why I'm very pleased to see all of you here today. And this is why I'm always honored to speak to people about this subject, because we have to remember that those who died on this day 64 years ago today died simply so that we could remember and know what happened there. And that's a very serious obligation that we have, never to forget. I'm going to talk now at some length about the history of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, and also something about Jasenovac, and also something about the subject that I was asked to speak about, which is this question about remembering the Holocaust, how it's remembered, and how that affects our understanding of the Holocaust. So I'll try to take them in more or less that order. And then, of course, we must have time for questions and dialogue, because dialogue is the most essential part of education and of learning. So I certainly, perhaps Professor Petrovich will inform me when I want to make sure there's at least 25 minutes, 30 minutes for discussion and questions and dialogue. Well, let me begin by just saying that Jasenovac was a camp in the area known, which is today a country of Croatia, which was established in August of 1941 and was in full operation actually by November of 1941, but was actually planned even before the war began, as early as the late 1930s, by the fascist movement inside of Yugoslavia. It had 5 major camps, which were built. There were 5 parts to this camp. Altogether, it was probably the 3rd largest camp during the entire Holocaust. Certainly Auschwitz was the largest, and I'm not sure which the 2nd largest was right off the top of my head, but it was certainly the 3rd largest in terms of size. Geographically, it may have even been the biggest in terms of its total geographic size, but in terms of the number of inmates and number of victims, it's the 3rd largest in the Holocaust. It was established after, of course, Adolf Hitler invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941, because the country was broken up by Hitler in April 1941. In April 1941, Hitler had actually, in March of 1941, Hitler wanted the then leader of Yugoslavia, who was Prince Paul, who was serving as a regent for his nephew, Peter, to sign a document known as the Tripartite Pact. And the idea of the Tripartite Pact was to allow Yugoslavia as an ally, so that Hitler could move his armies through Yugoslavia and basically control southeastern Europe, because there was trouble in Greece, and also Hitler was planning his invasion of the Soviet Union for the spring of 1941. So if the leader of Yugoslavia simply signed this and just rolled over and allowed Hitler to use the whole country of Yugoslavia as his tool, then everything would be fine, and Hitler could go right ahead to the invasion of the Soviet Union and to pacify the civil war, or the fighting that was going on in Greece, because Mussolini had invaded Greece and Albania had done a pretty bad job, had botched it pretty badly, so German troops had to go down there. Prince Paul signed it. But then, a few days later, the Serbian military officers, a group of Serbian military officers, overthrew the government and replaced it with the young Prince Peter, and rejected or refused Hitler's offer on the Tripartite Pact. That's what sparked Hitler's outrage and invasion of Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941. These events occurred between March 24th. The previous events I just mentioned occurred between March 24th and March 27th. All of this has to be viewed in the context of Hitler attempting to win the war by, but in a very, as typical of Hitler, in a kind of crazy way of attacking the Soviet Union, defeating the Soviet Union, and then trying to win the war that way. Well, because of what the Serbian Officer Corps did, Hitler reacted with outrage. He went berserk. He said that he would punish the Serbs, and of course Hitler. We should bear in mind that Hitler was of Austrian origin. Actually, he was he was of Catholic upbringing. He was from this country, Austria, a German country, but a German country that had ruled the northern half of Yugoslavia in the 19th century. Well, the invasion of Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941, led to the carving up of Yugoslavia into more than a dozen parts. The eastern part of Serbia was put under the German military command. So that was actually under German control, Serbia. The western parts of Croatia and Bosnia were put under the control of the Croatian fascist movement, the Ustaša. So a Croatian government was established on April 10, 1941, under the Croatian fascist leader Ante Pavelić, and both Croatia and Bosnia were given to them. The southern regions of Kosovo and Macedonia were to be split between the Albanian fascists, because Albania had been an ally of the fascists and then was under later was under Italian rule, and then the Bulgarians who had signed the tripartite pact but who were not actually involved in the Holocaust, but nevertheless they were given most of Macedonia, not all of it, but most of about 80% of Macedonia. So the western fringes were given to Albania. And then of course Slovenia, which is a very interesting place in the northwestern corner of the country, was more or less divided up and disappeared. It was divided up between Germany, Italy, and the Croats. Montenegro, the last bit of this puzzle, and some of the western coast of Yugoslavia was given to Italy. So Montenegro and Italy was to be part of the Italian Empire. And that pretty much ensured that the Holocaust would be carried out in Yugoslavia, and that it would be a triple genocide. The Holocaust in Yugoslavia is unlike anywhere else during the Holocaust. It is unique. And perhaps because of its complexity and its uniqueness, it hasn't been given all of the attention that it deserved over the last 60 years. It's perhaps not a part of most curriculum, and so this is why this education is so important. But anyway, I think now we see exactly what is going to happen in Yugoslavia. The country is divided into all of these parts. The two main parts are controlled by Nazi Germany, Serbia for the most part. Oh, and there were some, I should add that the northeastern part of Yugoslavia was given to the Hungarians, who were also fascist collaborators during World War II, and a little bit was given to the Romanians also on the eastern fringe. So you have gifts of territory to all of the friends of Adolf Hitler and of Mussolini, and but of course a large part of it for the Germans. Well, what happened next was already in April of 1941 was a massive uprising among the Serbian population. And Serbs had lived in both Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia, so they were dispersed throughout the country. This this uprising definitely triggered events in Yugoslavia. It triggered Hitler's reaction and Mussolini's reaction and Pavelić's reaction, and it led to a speeding up of the events of the Holocaust, or the carrying out of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia. And that's why Jasenovac was a camp that was already in operation exterminating Serbs, Jews, and Romas in 1941, even before this conference. The Nazis organized a conference on the Holocaust, the famous conference that you may have learned about in your history courses, called the Wannsee Conference. The Wannsee Conference was the conference where Hitler, or the Nazis, organized or discussed the final solution, the total extermination of the Jews in Europe. So the Holocaust was triggered by the fact that there was this Serbian uprising going on, and Hitler had to divert 24 divisions. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops had to be diverted from the invasion of the Soviet Union to Yugoslavia, simply because there was this massive Serbian uprising. The Serbian uprising was led by two groups. There was the first group that started the uprising were the same military officers who had overthrown Prince Paul on March 27, 1941. They were called the Chetniks. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful in their efforts to actually win victory in World War, at the end of the war, because the other resistance movement to the Nazis was called the Partisans, and that was led by the Communists, led by Joseph Broz Tito. Tito was the one who, and his army was the one that eventually would come to power after the war. But so powerful was this Serbian resistance to the fascists that both Churchill and Roosevelt gave it credit as being almost really equivalent to an entire army in this stage of the war, when the Nazis really had the advantage in World War II. In 1941, the Nazis seemed to be invincible. They had just conquered France. They had kicked Britain out of Europe. And they were about to embark on the invasion of the Soviet Union. As I said, 24 divisions had to be sent down on top of 4 divisions that were already sent when they invaded the country on April 6, 1941. So, in other words, Hitler was unable to invade the Soviet Union. He had to postpone it. Well, the consequences of that for world history are extraordinary. As we know, the fact that Hitler postponed the invasion of the Soviet Union from April or May of 1941 to the end of June 1941 was the reason why he was ultimately unable to defeat the Soviet Union. The Nazi army froze and failed to win a victory. Continued to fight in the Soviet Union until 43, but by 43 they had lost the initiative. They had lost that opportunity that they had in 1941 to defeat the Soviet Union, because they had postponed it until the winter, until it was too late. The winter came. They could not finish what they had begun. And the ultimate defeat of the Nazis, of course, in the Soviet Union was the Battle of Stalingrad, which by January 1943 decided not merely the fate of the Soviet Union, but the fate of the war itself. So the Serbian uprising in 1941 is of incredible importance in World War II and in world history. But it also guaranteed that Serbs would be sent to death camps for extermination by the Nazis. I think, in a way, it's kind of a no-brainer that was going to happen. I don't think we should say that that's the only reason that Serbs were targeted by the Nazis for extermination. Actually, the Nazis didn't intend to exterminate all the Serbs. It was the Croats who planned to exterminate as many of the Serbs as they possibly could. The Nazi policy was simply to exterminate so many of them that they would be punished and subjugated for this uprising. But they never could kill enough to succeed in that. So the Nazis established inside of Serbia a bunch of concentration camps to carry out the final solution. And they did so much earlier than they did in a lot of other places. And even the camps that they established in Yugoslavia were in operation even before the camps in Poland. And I don't think people realize that the final solution of the Jews took place in Yugoslavia before it did in Poland or anywhere else in the world. This is the first place where, as Adolf Eichmann, one of Hitler's top men handling the final solution, said, he said that Belgrade is the first city that is Judenfrei, that is free of Jews. Well, what he meant by that is that they rushed the Holocaust into operation in Serbia. They established in Serbia the camp of Sajmište, or which in German was called Semlin, which is today in the center of Belgrade. It was actually in Belgrade itself, the conquered capital, now occupied by German forces and the German High Command. There, by 1942, they had wiped out all of the Jews of Serbia that they could find. A lot of Jews fled westward into Bosnia and Croatia and to the coast. And we'll talk about them in a moment. But the majority of the Jews, particularly men, women, and children, were first the men were killed and then were exterminated, and then the women were exterminated in Serbia, the Jewish men and women, and then they began to exterminate the Roma, and of course the Roma were sent to these camps after the Jews, and the Serbs were being hanged for the most part. Publicly, or else they were exterminated in schools, as in the case of Kragujevac, a city in central Serbia, or southern Serbia, where they actually massacred hundreds, actually thousands of children, Serbian children, at a school, and that's one of the worst war crimes of all of the Holocaust. What happened at Kragujevac. But in Belgrade, at the Sajmište camp, or Semlin, it's called, in German it would be called the Semlin Lager, or the Semlin camp, Semlin. In Serbian, the name would be Sajmiste, Sajmiste. And at the same time, the Croats built this massive camp called Jasenovac, a camp that actually was in the center of Croatia and was organized to exterminate Jews, Romas, and Serbs. I want to say something else about the German occupation. The Germans never thought that Yugoslavia would take up so much of their time and energy. And of course, it led to their destruction that they did. But the Germans had a long history in the area that became known as Yugoslavia, because Germany had long viewed this as part of its strategic backyard, its area of colonization. There was a saying by the old Chancellor of Germany, one of the founders of Germany, Otto von Bismarck. He used to say, "Our backyard is from the Baltics to the Balkans," and he meant that area that became known as Yugoslavia was part of their territory. And indeed, if we go back in history, we see that the northern half of Yugoslavia, where Croatia, Slovenia, and northern Bosnia is, and even northern Serbia, historically was part of the Austrian Empire. It had been colonized by the Austrians, parts of it as early as the 1500s. And so the southern half of what became known as Yugoslavia had been under the control of the Turkish Empire. This was a kind of meeting point between West and East in Europe. And the Turks had been in the southern half of Yugoslavia since the 1300s. So there were two dominant global powers there, the Germans in the north and the Turks in the south. And that actually had major consequences for how the people in the region changed. Because the Slavs in Yugoslavia actually are all really one people. But over time, they evolved because the northern Slavs were under the German Catholic domination, and the Serbs were under the Muslim Turkish domination. And so this influenced, this was ultimately a cause of the divisions between, say, Serbs and Croats later on in history, because the Serbs held on to their old Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and the Croats converted to the Roman Catholicism of the Austrian Germans. But what this also is important to understand is that Germany, and Hitler himself, being an Austrian and being a Catholic, really had this emotional tie to the old Austrian Empire, as did many southern Germans. He had this emotional connection to the old empire of the Austro-Hungarian days, which he had fought for in World War I as a private. And he had enormous hatred, we see in his writings, for the Serbs as a nation. The Serbs, on the other hand, were viewed as troublemakers, and rightfully so, in the Balkans. They had been leaders of a national liberation movement that went back to the French Revolution. If we go back to the French Revolution, we must remember that the French Revolution really is the grandmother, or I don't know what the metaphor would be, but granddad, grandma, whatever, of democratic politics in the modern world. I mean, and of the idea of national unity and the rights of nations to be free from colonial subjugation. Not everything the French Revolution did was wonderful, but for the most part we have to tip our hats to the French Revolution for that. The Serbian nationalist liberation movement began during the time of the French Revolution, and in 1804 already, while Napoleon was in power, in fact, led a massive revolt against the Turks. From that point on, all through finally the Serbs won their independence or semi-independence in 1830, and by 1878 were a pretty important independent country in its own right, with its own democratic constitutional monarchy, in fact. So the Serbs had played this role of very similar to, in the spirit of the French Revolution, as being these national liberators, as a kind of, in Italy, there was a similar movement in the 1800s because Italy had been colonized too. And the Italian movement was based in a place called Piedmont. And so Serbia was said to be the Piedmont of the Balkans, the beacon of the national liberation movement against colonialism. So in a certain way, the Serbs were targeted and seen as these perpetual troublemakers for the great powers of Europe. Perpetual instigators. Evil people, basically. Evil people like the Jews and like the Gypsies. So you have to, what I'm getting at is that there was a long-standing hatred for Serbs among Germans. In fact, at the beginning of World War I, there was a pop song. I don't know who sang it exactly, but there was a popular song in Germany and in Austria in 1914 when World War I started. And the title of it was Alle Serben müssen sterben, which it's not funny. I shouldn't laugh, but the title means all Serbs must die. And that was a pop tune in Germany in the fall of 1914 when World War I started. But anyway, so what I'm trying to show you that Hitler came into this whole operation and established things in Yugoslavia with a past history in his mind of hatred for the Serbs, as well as his long-standing hatred for the Jews and for the Gypsies. And we know that everywhere else in Europe, Hitler was determined to destroy the Jews and the Gypsies, but the Serbs happened to just live in Yugoslavia, so this was the place where he could commit a triple genocide, Serbs as well as Jews and Gypsies. And this also raises another very important point. Maybe you might consider this not very important, but it's something that I have to raise at this point, and that is Hitler represented German imperialism. Mussolini represented Italian imperialism. And all of the leaders of the little fascist countries, like Croatia and Hungary, and in Romania, they all had, and even the Albanians and the Bulgarians, they all had in their minds a concept of a greater country, of conquering territories to make their country greater, and also to rip off and rob the people that they conquer. So imperialism is a very important cause of the Holocaust. And when we dedicate ourselves to opposing racism and fascism, I think we should also dedicate ourselves to opposing imperialism. We should bear that in mind, because there's never been a genocide committed that wasn't also committed in the name, not just of racial hatred. Racial hatred is the cart that follows the horse. Let me tell you that. The real cause of racial hatred is greed and theft and power and imperialism. The desire to colonize other people and then to control them and to rob them of everything they have, and then even to exterminate them and replace them with your own people. In Germany, Hitler called this, actually Hitler didn't invent this term, Bismarck did, but anyway, the word in German would have been Lebensraum. Lebensraum, maybe you've heard of this word, Lebensraum. Wir brauchen Lebensraum, they would say in Germany. We need our living space. And that's imperialism. That meant that they had to conquer these territories and exterminate the people, rob the people, take their land, and then create more territory so that they could move their people in. The Germans wanted to expand into Russia. They wanted to take all of Poland, all of Russia, all of the Balkans, and create this master race that would not just control, but populate the whole area. This is the dream of every fascist. This is the definition of fascism. It really is. This is, I think, as important to fascism, or maybe more important to fascism than even racial hatred, because the fascist movements begin with this idea of conquest. And that's where Mussolini got his idea, because Mussolini invented the word fascism, and Mussolini wanted to create an empire. Mussolini was more about empire than he was about racial hatred, I should add. It was Hitler who really emphasized the racial hatred part as a help, as an aid to a conquest. Well, the Croatian fascist movement was sponsored by first Mussolini and then by Hitler. As I said, Ante Pavelić was the founder of that movement, and right after World War I. A lot of this happened at the end of World War I. Fascism arose at the end of World War I. It arose at the end of World War I because there were old empires that were destroyed, and the ruling elites in those old empires wanted revenge and wanted to reconquer their lost territories. That's really where fascism comes in. Fascism comes in out of that experience of trying to reconquer your lost territories and to exterminate the people who are in your way. And so Mussolini founded the fascist movement in actually as early as 1917, toward the end of World War I, and came to power by 1922, 1923. And then he helped Hitler come to power in 1933. But 32, 33. But the thing is, and of course helped Hitler's Nazi fascist party to grow in the 20s. But Mussolini wasn't just about helping Hitler. He was about helping fascist movements everywhere in Europe. And so he helped sponsor not just the Croatian fascists, but Albanian fascists, Hungarian fascists, Romanian fascists. He even had supporters in the United States. He tried to encourage fascist politics in North America, as did Hitler later on. The story of Hitler and his relationship to Catholicism is one of the most intriguing and stories of the 20th century, because Hitler was himself born a Catholic. He was in favor probably of, he certainly was not in favor of the Catholic Church being dominant in Germany, but he had a kind of conflicted relationship with the Catholic Church in his life. But what we do know is he had very good relationship with the Pope during World War II, who was Pius XII. Pope Pius XII was someone who was rather sympathetic, one could say, towards some of these fascist movements. Pope Pius XII had very good relations with the Croatian regime. The Vatican was aware of what was going on in the Jasenovac concentration camp, where 600,000 died. It had emissaries to Croatia. And ultimately, after the war, Pope Pius XII allowed a lot of the former Nazis, German Nazis, Croatian Nazis, Italian fascists, all of these various fascist groups, to hide out in the Vatican after World War II. That became known as the rat lines, and that's another story about the Holocaust in World War II. That means, what that meant for Croatia was that actually not only was the Archbishop of Croatia, Stepinac, he was actually in the government, he was one of the leaders of the fascist government in World War II, but also priests and monks were in the military, they were in the concentration camps as guards and as actually organizers of the concentration camps. I want to wrap up by talking about how this is all played out, how this is all remembered in history. I think we can say that there are three kinds of memory in history. There is the memory of the individual. There's individual memory. And that's extraordinarily important, especially in the case of the Holocaust, where the testimonies of survivors, but also sometimes testimonies of perpetrators, provide incredibly important information that you wouldn't get anywhere else. Because, of course, the Nazis were criminals. The Ustascha were criminals. They did not want any records to be kept. So very often it was only individual memory, survivor testimony in particular, or sometimes perpetrator testimony, that we have as teaching us about certain details about what went on during the Holocaust. Then we have collective memory. And collective memory we can speak of as being sort of the mainstream understanding that societies preserve about the Holocaust. Both individual memory and collective memory is not history. Memory is never history. Memory is important. History is impoverished without it. But memory is a source. It is either a primary source or a secondary source that historians must evaluate. We cannot take testimonies from survivors or perpetrators at face value. We must evaluate them critically, but objectively. We must treat them as we would treat any source. So we can't necessarily, and I'm someone who has studied survivor testimony for almost 20 years now, I can tell you, as sympathetic as I am to it, I understand the limitations of both of individual memory. On the other hand, collective memory can be even more problematical. Collective memory is how society chooses to remember things. During the communist era in Yugoslavia, the communist government did not want to remember the Holocaust in the way it really needed to be remembered. It's not to say that they totally suppressed it, but they kept it down. Because it was contrary to the idea of the unity and equality of all the nations under communism. The slogan of communist Yugoslavia under Tito was brotherhood and unity. And that's a very noble thing, and I'm all in favor of brotherhood and unity. But I'm also in favor of justice. And we have to remember that one of the lessons of the Holocaust is if you don't denazify, if you don't fight as hard as you can for justice, for crimes committed like these, then you're setting yourself up for those crimes to be committed again and again and again. And ultimately, the failure of communist Yugoslavia to remember the Holocaust properly and to denazify, and it wasn't necessarily a deliberate thing. And there were certainly pressures from outside on Yugoslavia not to denazify the country, not to punish all the former Nazis that lived inside the country, the Croats, and not to remember the victims, give them their due as they should have. All of that led to the breakup of Yugoslavia. It's one of the reasons why Yugoslavia failed in the end, why it exploded into civil war. Because these political cultures, since they were not destroyed after the war, they continued to live underground. It's like an infection after an operation. If there's an infection under your wound, it will fester, and ultimately it can kill you. And that's exactly what happened in Yugoslavia. The country did not denazify, the memory of the Holocaust was not treated properly, and ultimately it's still a problem. It's a wound that has never healed for the peoples of the Balkans. I don't want to take up any more time because I want to have questions and answers, and I know I haven't spoken to every possible issue today, but I just want to say that we are lucky to be alive. We're grateful to be alive. The remembrance of the Holocaust it's like really about biological survival. It's what enables people to live. We don't remember it. I mean, that you could say that is a political use of the Holocaust, but frankly, it's a good one. We have to remember, and hopefully we can build a better world by coming together and understanding that if we do not remember the Holocaust and remember the crimes committed against Jews and Serbs and Romas, we are allowing a terrible evil to live on, and that could come back and harm us all. So I want to thank you for being here today, and I'm very honored to be here, and I hope you'll have questions, and I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you. Yes, please. Collective, I'm sorry, and analyzed memory. And that's really you see, that's why, yes, I'm sorry about that, thank you. Analyzed memory, what I would call analyzed memory, and this is really historians' treatment of memory. And that's the most important form, that's the most reliable form, because the job of the historian is not really to record facts. You might think it is, but the real job of the historian is to evaluate facts, to evaluate testimonies. That's the real job of history and of historians. And so It's true that the historian himself or herself can be prone toward ideological and subjective and wrong conclusions. But at least the idea of objectively and critically evaluating memory and how we remember things can possibly lead to corrections. There's reasons for why individual memory can also be flawed. Because individuals themselves are not trained as historians. They are subject to ideological pressures in their own societies. When you examine how survivor testimonies from the Holocaust change over years, one thing you notice is that the testimony sometimes excludes certain details or emphasize certain details that are influenced by the political culture of the time, by the ideological forces of the time. So, you see, what happens is even we have to be critical of some survivor testimony. We have to understand that survivors are not historians, that they're telling what they recall, that sometimes there's embellishments and sometimes things are left out. On the other hand, as I said, without these testimonies, history is impoverished because we would not have the information that is good. But ultimately, the task of the historian is the analyzed memory, this third form of memory. We cannot trust either individual memory or collective memory, unfortunately. It's prone by nature to all kinds of deficiencies. But that's, and I can give you lots of examples of also how collective memory can go wrong too. I mean, one example, I think, I've already mentioned the example in Yugoslavia. The fact that the way the Holocaust was remembered in Yugoslavia was wrong. They didn't denazify. They emphasized the unity of people. They emphasized the resistance movement. Well, you know, over 4,000 Jews fought, Yugoslav Jews fought in the resistance movement. Over 1,500 of them died in combat. There were Roma partisans who also fought and died in the resistance movement. So, and there was, certainly it's a great thing to emphasize. I don't deny that that's a great thing to emphasize. But by playing that up and not playing up the crimes and the victimhood of these people, what happened, the martyrdom, really, of these victims, they didn't want to emphasize that. They didn't want to rock the boat between the nationalities. They wanted to preserve brotherhood and unity at all costs. A noble goal, but it had its negative consequences. And collective memory does not tell the whole story. The U.S. Holocaust Museum, let me emphasize something about this. The U.S. Holocaust Museum is a great institution, but it too is an example of collective memory gone bad. And let me tell you why. In 1993, the U.S. Holocaust Museum was opened by President Bill Clinton. He invited the countries that he wanted to invite to it. He invited the president of Croatia, who was an apologist for the Holocaust, Franjo Tuđman. He did not invite Serbs, and the Jews of Yugoslavia organized a huge boycott of that opening. Tuđman was an extreme. He was the first president of independent Croatia in the 1990s, and he was an extreme anti-Semite. He was an extreme hater of Serbs and of Gypsies, or Romas, I should say, because Gypsies is a pejorative term. I shouldn't use it, but I use it because people are more familiar with it. And the U.S. Holocaust Museum catered to a depiction of the Holocaust that favored the foreign policy of the U.S. government. I can read you I'll give you a brief reading of something from the U.S. Holocaust Museum's own, its own publication. Let's see if I can grab it here. Well, I'll just tell you this, that the U.S. Holocaust Museum itself bragged about the fact that it excluded the story of Yugoslavia from its exhibition in the 1990s, because it said that we're fighting to stop genocide that is committed allegedly by Serbs, so he was really saying we're carrying out the policies of President Bill Clinton. And so therefore we're going to exclude the story of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia in order to help Bill Clinton. Well, that's an example. Now, all of that has been changed since 2000, but I just wanted to say that this is an example where society's collective memory is flawed, and sometimes very badly flawed. I'm sorry that I took so long in answering that question. Yes, please.
Why is it that Auschwitz receives much more press, media coverage, etc., than Jasenovac?
Well, Auschwitz deserves all the attention that it gets because it was the largest camp by far in the Holocaust. And, we're talking about 2 million victims. We're talking about a place where perhaps 1 million children, mostly Jewish children, were killed. Auschwitz, I would not deny Auschwitz any of the attention that it gets, but I do think that Jasenovac has been neglected partly for political reasons. Michael Berenbaum pointed out something interesting once. He said, well, it's not simply, and Michael Berenbaum was the first research director of the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and he worked for President Bill Clinton. Michael Berenbaum said, yes, it was inconvenient in the 1990s for us to talk about Jasenovac, and he was sad about that. He was upset that the political forces from the State Department actually kept the U.S. Holocaust Museum from actually talking about Jasenovac. So that's one reason. But as Michael Berenbaum said, he also said, well, first of all, you have to understand, knowledge about the Holocaust really began to take off after the 1970s. And so it really was only in the 1980s and 1990s and the museum itself was only created in 1993. So to some extent, knowledge of the Holocaust really only began to pick up steam in the 1990s. And it just happened to be at a bad time for Yugoslavia. It happened to be at a time when the United States and European countries were in conflict with Yugoslavia and with the Serbs in particular. And so, for that reason, Jasenovac was downplayed deliberately by the U.S. government. But there's also another reason. Michael Berenbaum pointed this out also. Yugoslavia is simply more complicated. Poland is, and where Auschwitz was, is in some respects easier to explain. The death camps in Poland, of which Auschwitz was the number one, is easier to explain in many respects because it's really about the extermination of the Jews and to some extent, well, to a large extent, Soviet soldiers, prisoners of war, and Polish inmates, some Polish inmates as well. But for the most part, it's an easier story to explain because it's Hitler carrying out the final solution after the Wannsee Conference. So that's how I would answer that question. Are there?
There's a question here on the move.
Oh, I'm sorry. No. Yes, please.
Yeah. Mussolini wanted their territory. Hitler was fighting the Yugoslavs for racial reasons, but the Croatian, why were they fighting?
Oh, well, the Croats also wanted territory. Now, you see, what happened... Okay, this is a very good question, and this is a good example of why the Yugoslav case is so complicated. The Croats had not had a country before. They had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire. They had been loyal devotees of that empire. But there was a Croatian nationalist movement that was influenced by what was going on in Serbia that wanted a Croatian country. In World War I, the Croats fought with the Austrians. They fought for Germany and Austria, and in World War I, they fought on the losing side. But they still wanted, after the breakup of the Austrian Empire, they wanted their own country. So, ultimately, the Croatian fascist movement was also, in many respects, an expression of this desire to create an independent Croatian state. But the Croatian state that they would have created would have been rather small if it had been created by diplomatic means. So the fascist movement saw as its goal to take over Serbian and Bosnian Muslim territory and Jewish territory and exterminate all of those populations and create a greater Croatia. And so that was the plan of the Croatian fascists. The slogan was "For the homeland." That was when they gave the Heil Hitler salute, the Croatian fascists, they said, "For the homeland, I am ready." That was their slogan. And that meant we are ready to destroy everybody in our path and create this Croatian state that would take over and exterminate the Serbian, Jewish, and Roma populations and displace them with Croatian populations. And that's why the whole Jasenovac camp was actually planned out in the 1990s. So they were fighting for a homeland, yes, but a homeland in which they would displace millions of people because there was a very large Serbian, Jewish, and Roma population in Croatia, and so they had to be removed in order for there to be a successful Croatian state. But also it would mean stealing all their property too. That's, I guess, the best answer I can in a short time. Okay. Oh, is that it? No more questions?
I thank you all very much for coming here.